Hello, welcome to the Pulling the Threads podcast. This is another two-parter. In this interview, David LeBlanc is interviewing me. This one went kind of long, so I decided to cut it into two. Hopefully you enjoyed the first part, learning about my story with some new details you may not have heard before. And make sure you tune in next week for the second part. Also, make sure you like and subscribe and follow on YouTube. Follow us on Spotify and join the Facebook group, as well as join the discussion at JesusTheJewWithinJudaism.com. And I hope to see you on the next podcast. And so today we're gonna do a different type podcast. Instead of me interviewing somebody, today David is gonna interview me. And so why don't you go ahead and start?
Well, hi, Jeremiah. I'm Dave LeBlanc, and I've had my own podcast that I've kind of deactivated. I used to do a lot of interviews myself, so you asked me to do this for you, which I'm happy to do. What's striking to me is just as a form of introduction, you've introduced me a couple of times to your audience, but you and I have very many similarities to our background. Not completely parallel, but there's a lot of parallels, especially as we go further on our journey. I guess, most of your audience that's not new to your program will be familiar with where you're at, but for the sake of just setting a groundwork here before we delve into your story, how would you describe yourself spiritually today? Like where would you find yourself camping your wagon at right now?
Where would I camp my wagon? I identify as Jewish. I went through conversion. Situationally, that's, practice the holidays, practice kosher, Shabbat, all that kind of stuff. I'm definitely more of a philosophical person. And so I would say that I'm grounded historically and factually in like the way things are. If you would ask me about religion in general, I would say that I'm agnostic about most denominational organized religions. I believe in God, a higher power that I feel is helped me throughout my life, or at least helped me make better decisions than I would make of my own. If we get into my story, we can talk about why I feel that that's something that's still important to me. But it kind of all goes back to it's kind of the thought about the divine spark in everybody. The Netzotze Elohim, that there's this divine spark in everything, and the klipo, the things that kind of cover things up. I don't think that, for me and my family, Judaism is the religion that I practice and that morally, philosophically, ethically aligns with my personal value system, and I guess always has. But when it comes to like the denominations, the structures, the people, I believe all of that's fallible. It's human. I don't subscribe to the view that there's only one way and there's no other way. For me, this is what works. And within Judaism, we say the righteous of all, people have a place in the world to come. But I guess to start it off, that's kind of where I would situate myself.
That's fair, yeah. And for disclosure for the audience, for those who don't know, I share with you a journey out of Christianity and into Judaism. I also formally converted with my wife through the conservative movement, as you did. And the reason I bring this up is because those who are seeking, there's many different types of people that would subscribe or watch videos such as you and I have produced that deal with more scholarly, kind of an intellectual approach to the concepts of religion or various different traditions. That would be certainly outside the purview of what, when many people think about observant Jews, they think of the black hat crowd with, the ultra orthodox, praying at the Western Wall kind of thing, in their little communities in the cities of America and elsewhere. So you obviously, like myself, have been fascinated over the years, especially recently, with the philosophies and the variety of thought within the Jewish world that is available. But you're not so much attracted, maybe that's the wrong word, but you don't really gravitate towards the more extreme versions of Jewish orthodoxy, which I find is very interesting to me because, not to make it about me, but like you, I had a variety of background experiences in religion that one of the things I wanted to avoid as I matured was getting into more extremism after coming out of extremism, you know.
Yeah.
So now that we've established where you're at currently, you have a fascinating background that you shared some bullet points with me prior to this interview. And I wanted to start right at the beginning, which I think is a really interesting place to begin for people to understand how you've arrived where you're at now. You shared with me that you were raised in a home of Jehovah's Witnesses from the time you were very young, and that you didn't take long before you started questioning various aspects of that. As you matured and get towards puberty, you had a very inquisitive mind, and that by the time you were 18, you were openly asking questions about everything. And you also mentioned that there was some tension in your family with your dad, which I also experienced, which I think was a big impact on why I was also searching. So I wondered if you could speak to those early years, what your home life was like, and how your home life affected the way you viewed your family's religious devotion, and how that affected you as you grew into maturity.
All right. Well, I would say, to start it off, that my home life drove me to God. Um, to wanting to believe in a higher benevolent power that cared about my plight. Um, so, growing up in a home where emotional and physical violence is normalized, your views a bit skewed from what people who grow up in a safe home would be. Um, I experienced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse from my father, and it was something that took me many years to deal with. Now, my father isn't the one that converted to Jehovah's Witnesses. Um, my mother converted to Jehovah's Witness when I was 4. And I'll kind of get into my dad's background in a little bit. Maybe all the stuff going on, the ingredients played into the soup that made me, of course, because they're my parents. But my mom had a sudden infant death uh, at I think it was like 3.5 months, a stillborn child, and then she just couldn't handle the idea of having another child, so she had an abortion. Ridden with guilt, the Jehovah's Witnesses come knocking on the door and provide her something that was appealing to a broken soul at that time. So my mom became a Jehovah's Witness, and she was pretty devout about it. Threw everything all in it. When you don't have to take responsibility for yourself or your problems, and somebody tells you what to do, it's an easy way to go when you're going through hard times. So I feel like they take advantage of people that way. So my background on my mom's side is a little bit mixed. My grandfather was an Irish Catholic, so before she converted, I think they went to some Irish Catholic stuff when she was a kid. There is some nominal like Jewish ancestry that goes back to Spain and Sephardic, but halakhically I wasn't Jewish. That's why I chose to convert. But there's some ancestry there. But the big thing is my parents raised me. My mom decided she was kind of left in charge of it, so she made me and my sister go to the Jehovah's Witness thing. My father was of German descent, and his family was Catholic. He went to parochial schools. He was sent to Sunday school. He would go in the front door and out the back door. But he was not an adherent to Catholicism. When I was growing up, he got into the Celestine prophecy or something like that. It was some metaphysical book about seeing the auras on people. You have a blue or green aura kind of stuff he talked about.
Huh.
He studied some Jehovah's Witness stuff. And then he studied with a Native American witch doctor. And had me a little concerned for a while there because right around the time of the Hale-Bopp comet,
I
he was
remember that.
he was talking about some of that stuff, and he had a conversation with me, and this plays into like the mental health issues later. He had a conversation with me about if you commit suicide, make a point with it. And this is in like, there's a spaceship behind this comet, and I guess that they were going to commit suicide to go up this spaceship in the sky. When that group committed suicide, I was kind of in desperation trying to reach out to my father to make sure he was still alive. Come to find out he was just associated with people who had strange beliefs and espoused some of them. But I never adhered to his way of life. One of the defining moments for me, and this would have been later on, this is because I'm jumping around. It wouldn't be formative. It's more when my parents went through divorce between my junior high and high school. It would have been around junior high, maybe 8th grade. Actually, no, it was the summer school before 8th grade, high school. So it was right between junior high and high school. My parents were living separate, and I was given the involuntary choice of being with my father. Involuntary as in I didn't have a choice. But so I come home from school and he goes, tell me something about your day. What did you like? And so like this science teacher told me like some really cool stuff, and I was just like kind of going off like that this is so cool, blah 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 blah. And then all of a sudden he just got really he became dogmatic, basically telling me it was crazy. And I was like, well, he's a tenured professor. He studied this. This is his specialty. I'm gonna go with science on this one, because he was espousing just some fringe theory that wasn't grounded or rooted in any kind of science or history or facts or anything. And so, anyways, he comes around the table, chases me down the hallway, punches me in the throat. We end up on the ground. He's got me pinned to the floor, and he goes, "Why did we do this?" And I'm like, "You punched me. I don't know." That was how my
So,
father was, though.
so it went from having a conversation to he just became very volatile,
Yeah,
and you were just trying to share information, answering his question.
yeah.
And I don't, neither one of us want to belabor on this aspect, but I'm just trying to understand. So it sounds to me like it escalated extremely quickly in a very confusing way, but it seems like it was not so confusing in that there was a repeated pattern of this. And he literally got violent when you started proclaiming things that he was threatened by, ideas that he was threatened by.
Yeah, and that was kind of how he was. He talked about in his childhood how he was bullied and he had physical violence happen to him. That's why I was pinned to the ground. He starts to tell me this story about how, of all places, to get a lesson like this one, when I think he was around 18 or something, must have been around the time I was born. A couple of his friends got him drunk. This is why I'm on my back being pinned to the floor. And they ended up stealing his car and leaving him without a car. So the next day he goes and he finds each one of them, he beats them up, and then he gets his car back. Quite an interesting place to tell me a story like that.
Yeah.
So it was a challenging environment. It's taken me many years of therapy, counseling, support group to get to the point where I've worked through it. And, as a father, I feel like I've done a great job with my children navigating the difficulty. So it's not like something I've got to an interesting place in my life that I am thankful that I am stronger and more aware, and I'm stronger than I would be if I hadn't had those experiences. I would not wish those experiences on anybody,
Hmm.
but I am thankful for the strength that I have, that other people don't have the same strength. So to go
Can I
back,
interrupt
like,
for 1 second?
go ahead.
Because I just want to emphasize something here that you're touching on it, and I know that we never want to spend time talking about our own attributes. So I want to do that for you here for a second, because here you are, you have this blog and this podcast, and you're trying to pursue an intellectual conversation about origins, um, Pulling the Thread podcast. And you've expressed to me privately and also publicly that your motivation in this is to really provide a platform that can help people that are similar to you and I, that really have genuine questions, that are not, we're not trolls trying to just tear people's faith structures down. We're literally trying to give people an opportunity to explore these ideas just as you have. And I just want to say that I'm not a psychologist, but to be able to live a functional life as an adult, hold a job, raise children, go through relationship stress, and still have the mental strength to be able to explore these ideas and at depths like you do, I think is a great. It's a great. I don't want to say testimony, but it's a great example of the human spirit, and how you really can't hold us down if we don't let ourselves be held down, no matter what we've been through. But we should always be empathetic to where people are coming from, because we just don't know what they've been through. People are carrying around a lot of pain, right? And so if you haven't been through pain, it's hard to be empathetic with others' pain. And so I've always sensed that from you in the time that you and I have interacted, that you are a very empathetic person, and you've always maintained a great sense of humor, which I think is a great sign of mental health. Is having a sense of humor about yourself and about your life, and so this is fascinating. So you went through this really dysfunctional relationship with your dad. Um, I should ask you. I'm sure that some of your audience might want to know: is your dad still alive?
Yeah, my father's still alive. Um, and he's alive. Um, I haven't talked to him in many years. Because unfortunately, he chooses to still be like that. And
You really
I don't
can't.
want my children to ever see me interact with my father in a way that would teach them that that kind of behavior is normal or okay. Uh, Even if I handle it right, I don't want to see that kind. I don't want them to see that kind of father-son interaction. Um,
Yeah.
because
What
even
about your
in his
mom? Is
adult
your
life,
mom?
he's huh?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'd say
I didn't-
even in my adult life, um, he still chooses to get in my face and try to get physically violent and stuff like that.
Yes, you
Um,
can't afford that when we're on your children. Yeah.
no, I won't. But you were
How
going to ask
about
me
your
a
mom?
question.
Where's your mom at today?
Um, my mom and sister are still very committed to the Jehovah's Witness religion.
Okay.
Um, so because of that, we've went through periods of I've been disassociated. I got disfellowship from the Jehovah's Witness because, of all things, I was training in martial arts to be able to protect myself, so I didn't have to be afraid of my father, in case he did something violent to me that wasn't. And I felt like telling me I couldn't train in martial arts to defend myself against a violent attack just wasn't something I could hold on to. Um, so,
Hmm.
um, but in my childhood, as challenging as it was, what gave me peace and centered me was I would go for walks and I would talk to God and I would pray and I just pour out my soul. Somewhere in there, I experienced freedom, um, acceptance, um, and then crying out for help. But the conflict with my dad I was talking about, we were literally arguing about something my science teacher told me, and it was like he was into all these fringe theories, and I was very much into like grounded facts and evidence and stuff like that. And I think like you kind of made a comment earlier in all these kind of events that happen, like early on, I didn't just accept or adopt like my mom's Jehovah's Witness thing. Um, by the time I was 8, which means she had only been doing it for about 4 years because I was 4 when she started. I was already asking how to go to heaven, and one of the elders was like, "You got to know the truth and become one of the 144,000." And all this is convoluted. They're stringing scriptures together, and I'm just like scratching my head, like, okay, that's a bit much. It's a lot. Um, and I remember I walked away from that, and I was walking to the front of like their, what are the kingdom halls, what they call it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was walking to the front, and I was like, I started to do a prayer that was like the way they would, and then I checked myself. I was like, Lord, teach me the truth. I go, no, teach me your truth. I want to know the truth. And so at that early age, that kernel was embedded in me. Like, I want to know the truth. And so the way that you know authentic between inauthentic, when you're dealing with money, they have you look at real, like legit money, and you study it, you get comfortable with it, the smell and everything, so that when you're given a fake, you know the difference between real and fake. And so I feel like for me, I read the New World Translation cover to cover once. I the New Testament presented so many challenges for me. And then I started again and I read the Tanakh again. And I just, at that point, I was just like, there was too much that I had issues with the New Testament. And I started going to the elders and challenging them on um, their view that, Jesus wasn't God and different things. I'm like, the text, it doesn't make sense. This isn't lining up. And
So let me ask you
one of the, well, what they ended this way.
Okay,
Let
go
me
ahead.
finish with this. Ended this way. And my supposition was different than what they said, but they're like, you know understanding that I don't agree. They're like, well, there are some things that you just have to take on faith. And I'm kind of making a mental note to myself, though. Yeah, you're crazy and I don't subscribe to that, was kind of what I took on faith when he said that.
Right.
I didn't take things at faith. I was like, no, we need to have proof and evidence for this stuff. So what were you gonna say?
Yeah, I apologize for jumping on you. I wanted to ask you, when you started having problems with the New Testament, you threw in the comment that you always appreciated the Tanakh. Of course, the Tanakh is a phrase you learned much later. Were you having a problem with the New Testament at that young age because your reading of the New Testament was difficult to square with Jehovah's Witnesses doctrine, or were you having a problem with the New Testament because of, or in addition to, your reading of the Old Testament of the Tanakh?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, so one, my first objections to the New Testament were almost at Matthew. It didn't line up with the Tanakh. And then secondly, the arguments I started having with the elders was about their interpretation of the New Testament. So my first thing was like, this doesn't line up. Salvation is this way and the Tanakh. What is this new salvation? But it's not supported in the Tanakh. What is this? It's a little bit convoluted. But to some degree, I kind of did take some of it on faith for a long time.
Well, you were
So I
young.
learned to question it. But and then the other one was I really took them to task with their interpretation of the New Testament, because I started to look into what I call the purple people eater. It's their diaglot, their purple diaglot. It was an old, it has the Hebrew English translation with the transliteration under it, and then their English translation on the side. So I had started, like, I was like, all right, if anything is true, one, it should if you test it against itself, it should be proven true among itself, right? So my first thing is, I'm hearing these things about Jehovah's Witness that maybe it's a cult, maybe there's this and that, and so I'm like, well, let me test the thing against itself and see if it actually holds weight. So I started to look at the Greek text, the translation, and then I look at their translation, and their transliteration isn't the same as the transliteration under where it goes Greek to transliteration, English, they're adding words. And I'm like, well, wait a second. So the actual Greek text does not support what you're saying. And so at that time, it supported more of a traditional Christian view. At that time, when I left Jehovah's Witnesses, which was about when I was 18, then I did take a path into Christianity, because at that time, based on the text I was looking at, that would have made more sense for me to explore and test it, against itself, kind of thing. But so I mean, to answer your question, it was a bit of, it didn't match the Tanakh, which the Jehovah's Witnesses called the Hebrew Scriptures, and they call the New Testament the Greek Scriptures, which it's a little nicer to have that term than Old and New Testament every time you say it. So my brain
Yeah, it's
wasn't
interesting, right? Yeah.
my brain wasn't completely embedded with the Old Testament, New Testament. They just say Hebrew Scriptures and Greek Scriptures, which, so that dichotomy, that works. I mean, one's a Hebrew text, one's a Greek text. So
Yeah.
but,
Okay.
yeah.
Right. But so, yeah, but your initial objections were that you weren't able to corroborate the claims upon their own testimony. So it wasn't like you were taking other religions or other sects' claims and working it against them. You were just having issues with their own explanations about their own tradition, because there was an incongruity in the text itself to what they were telling you. You weren't adding it up. So that made you open to exploring some other traditions. And then you mentioned to me that at some point after becoming an adult, you ended up meeting a Christian woman who it sounds like you had some type of relationship with, and she invited you to a charismatic meeting. So explain that a little bit and how you ended up getting exposed to the Assemblies of God.
So I was living with a woman. It's quite interesting story there, but I'm not going to get too much into that one.
No, I don't.
But
I'm just saying this is your next transition.
yeah. No, it was a really interesting. There was a lot of moving pieces on that one. I won't get too into it because it could get off into the weeds. But yeah, relationships have kind of influenced some of my choices to keep, I guess, the people happy. But and I was open. Like I had been kicked out of the Jehovah's Witnesses. I went to the library and I was reading on Judaism and Buddhism, and even at that time I remember thinking that Judaism is one of the oldest religions, and it was one that stuck out to me. But I was looking at all of them really, and like I had a torn rotator cuff. What was I doing that I got a torn rotator cuff? I think I was doing martial arts at the time. Well, I was. I don't recall what I did. Anyways, she invited me to this crusade at the Oceanside Pier Amphitheater. I think it
This
was
is in
put on by
California.
the Door Christian Fellowship. They're a really strong evangelical, charismatic, Pentecostal, healing, laying on hands. They had a big crusade down at the Pier Amphitheater there, and but I went by earlier, and they kind of put this incense in the air, so it kind of has a certain smell in the air and stuff like that. I just remember the smell of the incense that they had kind of burned in the place to make it have a certain odor. Before, like I noticed it before, but I think it was meant to add to the ambiance of the experience. We had the worship. It was really intense with the altar calls and stuff, and you kind of feel like if you don't go down, you got to go because everybody else is going. The only thing left is you and a ficus tree.
Have you actually read my book, or you just scanned it? I'm not sure if you actually read it yet.
I skimmed through it.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
So, well, I'm not putting you in the spot. The only reason I ask is because I had a whole chapter in my book about when I first got born again. That I befriended a guy I met at a business meeting, and he was part of a Southern Baptist church. And so I used to go with him, and I had been raised Roman Catholic. So I had never really experienced this Baptist style of service. And I found that, the choir singing was interesting. It was a lot more entertaining than the Roman thing where you kneel and you sit up and you sit and you stand and you kneel. And but I was fascinated by the preaching. but then, as you just mentioned, this is in a Southern Baptist environment. This is not the charismatic, which is, slightly more over the top, or a lot more over the top than what this was. But they had kneelers at the front of the church, and at the end of every service, and this was true of all Baptist environments that I had been in throughout my life, there would always be a slow melodic piano song at the end, where the pastor would kind of continue with his little homily, and they would start to invite people forward who wanted to either accept Jesus or pray. And of course, mostly it was people just praying about things. And it's funny, you made me laugh when you said that, because as a new believer who really was committed to wanting to really press in, I had this attitude, and I mentioned this in my book, that I was in it to win it, man. Like if you're going to do an altar call, I'm going to go forward. I don't care if I have to make up a reason. I'll think about something to pray about as I'm walking forward, but I want to be counted as one of those who was serious every single week. So there was never a time I didn't go forward. And I think that probably was true of a lot of people, that, you come to this new faith and you want everyone to say, hey, you can count on me. I'm here, kind of thing. I wonder if that was some of what you experienced when you got exposed to that.
I mean, there was a lot of peer pressure to run to the altar. And like the way they're preaching about all these sins and stuff is to like trigger this thought that God watches. He's going to tell them exactly my sin. I got to run and
you have to come
for this
clean.
thing.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I mean, it's just like, but it's like word salad. They're just throwing out random potential sins. So somebody feels guilty.
Going to cover everything. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So to answer your question, like how I got into the Assemblies of God, so I went to that crusade there, and I don't want to say gave my heart to Jesus, because I don't know, like I was Jehovah's Witness. I already believed he existed. Like I don't, but that was the terminology: born again, gave your life to him, whatever. And I started going to a small home Bible study for a while, and then we ended up going to an Assemblies of God, me and the woman I was dating at the time. And it was one of those ones that came back from the Pensacola revival. So there was
Yep.
There was a lot of really intense revival related stuff.
The holiness movement, the Brownsville. Yep.
Yes, speaking in tongues, laying on of hands, apostles
confessing
and prophets,
sin, forsaking behavior.
Yeah, very intense. It was like they did basically Hillsong style worship. And the preaching, the altar calls, we had various evangelists and prophets come through, and it was heavily into like the prophetic movement, and just like all that revival stuff.
How old were you?
There's a lot of emotionalism, huh?
How old were you at this time?
So between 18 and 21, because I went to Bible college when I was 21.
Right. So you're still involved in martial arts, and
a little less so at that time.
Oh,
well,
okay.
I was up until 97. Yeah.
But you didn't have any children at this time, and
no.
But just for context, I think this is really important to take note of for those who aren't really tracking here, or maybe maybe this is obvious, but so you had been disfellowshipped by Jehovah's Witnesses younger than that. So you already had this dysfunctional relationship with your dad, and your mom, not her personally, but her fellowship disfellowshipped you. And so you really were kind of sent adrift spiritually, kind of on your own. And so you mentioned earlier about the Jehovah's Witnesses, how they seem to kind of prey on people who are in crisis. But wouldn't you say that that's also the case with these evangelistic outreach type, seeker-friendly type environments where people are kind of broken? They're kind of like going through hard times. They're maybe lacking relationship stability. They're lacking home stability. And this becomes like a warm blanket of sorts. Would you say that that's accurate?
Very much so. Preying on human weakness to gain tithing supporters. Preying on people, I was, cut off from my family I felt, so the woman, I was in an abusive relationship. where I was experiencing like I got punched, I got attacked with car keys. Um, I wasn't doing this back. Um, but from a cycle of abuse, I moved to a cycle of abuse. So
Oh,
I
so you're
was
talking
in
about
an
the woman.
emotionally weak space myself.
Okay, yeah, right, right. Yeah,
So
so even this woman she had issues.
yes,
Right.
when you have a broken family environment, you sometimes fall in with people who the familial feeling for people who've been through trauma is sometimes broken, and you attract people like that. So I
Right.
had yet to have learned how to make better choices with my life. And so, yes, I was in a very dysfunctional relationship. And the fallacy I had grown up thinking I could love somebody when they're like that it's not going to help a person like that. You've got to, walk away from people when they're like that. But that was something I had to learn later in life. So anyways, yes, I was in an emotionally weak space. Their methods preyed upon my weakness. And then all of this excitement gave me something to focus on other than the pain and trauma in my life. So this excitement, I mean, this was interesting stuff. I mean, now mind you, they're talking about people being raised from the dead and people being healed and real actual miracles. I did a mission trip down to uh, Baja California. And nobody's getting out of wheelchairs. The blind aren't seeing. There's no actual. There was a episode where people I know with mental health crisis had manifested demons. I think it was a mental health breakdown. But it was treated like a demon, which I think was actually probably worse for that person.
Yeah, sure.
Um,
Absolutely.
and part of it was directed at me, and I was like, yeah, I'm not even part of that situation. So people are saying there's a demon here, there's a demon there, this is a demon, that's a demon. You're like, really? That's just a human that's been through trauma. They need emotional support. They need to learn how to
So
manage it.
are you saying that you were thinking that then, or this is back in reflection, looking back on it?
Um, I didn't know what it was at the time, but I know when they threw the aspiration to me, there wasn't a demon involved, and I actually did nothing. It was I'm like literally observing what's happening, and they're like,
Right.
"Well, the demon came in through you," and I'm, "What? Hold the
Okay.
phone." Ah, by the way, I was just sitting here, like not actually even. I mean, it was somebody who had a grudge against me and felt like I was a corrupting influence, yet I was not actually doing anything. So, like, if you don't do something they like, oh, a demon made you do it, which
Yeah.
I think goes to the dichotomy of the Christian view of good and evil, God and Satan. The devil made me do it. Uh, no,
I'm
we're all
curious.
human.
Yeah, so I want to really hone in on what you're talking about real briefly, without taking anything away from your overall story here,
Mm.
because I think in reading your blogs and listening to you, I think this is really germane to a lot of the things that you really try to hit on. Um, so you talked about your Jehovah's Witness experience, where you looked at the faith wanting to believe, but having logical inconsistencies in your mind with things that you were being told to believe versus what you were reading and seeing and hearing and believing in actual reality. And so now you're in this environment where, again, we've already established you've been cast adrift, you don't have a strong support system behind you, and now you're in this highly emotionally charged kind of electric atmosphere where there's almost an expectation of, it's almost like being at Mount Zion. Everybody's expecting like miracles any moment, and they're almost projecting it upon the audience, even when it's not there.
Mm.
Not almost, they are.
Mm.
And so was there like, before you got involved in missionary work and all this other stuff, I'm wondering if there was this period during this time where you just had this really uneasy feeling that things weren't sitting well with you, even though you were participating in it, or were you kind of along for the ride and kind of dawned on you that this was not right later?
So I've always been very Pollyannic. There's the old Disney movie Pollyanna. She was very happy-go-lucky and everything. Um, Naive to a degree, always believe the best, very positive. Despite all the stuff that happened to me, essentially relationships that are burning buildings behind me, still have a very positive view of the world. So there were things that did bother me and get my attention that I'm just kind of like, what is that? But I didn't stop at that time and go, oh, let's just throw the baby out with the bathwater and find a new thing. It was, I was exploring it, and like all things, to the depth that I can. I always go all in on things. Honestly, one of the philosophies that probably is defines me and the way that I process things comes from Jeet Kune Do, the martial art that Bruce Lee invented that was formative in my experience. And it's, to research your own experience, to honestly express yourself. And so, because it's a scientific fighting art, the idea of science was something that always kind of, it always came back to me. So like, that kind of was a grounding for me. But in that early experience, there were things that were, flags on the field that I just kind of was like, okay, well, that's interesting. But then I was full in with it. I was working at the church. I got to see behind the scenes. And then I went to Bible college. Because, this experience I had as a child, where when I was alone, I was able to pray and center and then make good decisions for my life. And I felt like I connected with the divine. I wanted to replicate this in, I guess, a religious setting, because that's the way I felt I needed to do that. So to kind of go back to a question earlier, I would define myself more as spiritual than religious now. But I felt like I had to find God in a religious setting. And I was passionate about it because I was able to work through things in my soul, get to a place where the trauma didn't hold me back. And so I want to get to a place where I can make this meaningful to others, or where I can make this meaningful in my life. And I'm being led to believe it's the environment around me, where I think it might have been the choices that I made versus the environment. But at the time, I felt like the environment around me was feeding this. They're praying for healing, miracles. It was very exciting. But I saw and the things I saw, like behind the scenes at the church, seeing very human process, intentional means of manipulation. We had an evangelist come through who taught how to manipulate a crowd to get them to heal, like literally like spilled the tea.
That was very common in the Assemblies of God. They had people that would go around training churches on how to handle those types of events. Yeah.
Well, and literally explain the whole process and kind of like manipulating and like trying to get people to fall out. And I'm like damn.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was like,
it's not what you envision. It's not the altruistic ideal.
Yeah. So I was just like, wow, like, okay. So, and that kind of pulled back the curtain for me a little bit. And that was right before I went to Bible college. I had seen the humanity, the things that were attributed to the Spirit during the sermon was stuff that I watched the pastor struggle with and asked me for the message to speak that week. And I'm like, yeah, God's not talking to me right now, bro. But, it was a very human process. But we're attributing all this stuff to the divine. There's, all these methods to manipulate people. And so I've already got this with the Jehovah's Witnesses, like, let's go with something foundational and compare it to these other things. And I'm already starting to see the ingredients of the soup. So I went to Bible college, and while I'm there, I kind of I became more studious. Like,
where did you go to Bible college?
Huh?
Where did you go to Bible college?
Southwestern Assemblies of God University.
Okay, yeah.
Studying church planning and pastoral ministries.
So let me ask you a question, because I know how Assemblies of God works, so I'm just kind of leading you here. But so at some point, correct me if I'm wrong, someone saw your eagerness and your zeal and pulled you aside, someone that you had some respect for, some measure of respect, and encouraged you to go down this path. Like, we think that you would be blessed,
Yes.
that God would use you if you went, right?
Yes. So my pastor definitely had this kind. I had volunteered at the church. I was basically a janitor at the church and building sets for plays and stuff. And but yeah, he pulled me in his office and he started talking to me about the calling.
Yeah.
You feel the calling, God calling you, and think you'd be a candidate. And there's this Assemblies of God college here in California, but it's too liberal. I don't think you should do it. You should go to this one I went to in Texas. It's in Waxahachie, Texas. Waxahachie. What's a Waxahachie? And so he encouraged me to go to the Bible college he went to. So yeah, I mean that was probably what led me to make that decision, especially where I went.
So you didn't really have a career at that point. You were just working odd jobs, whatever, and you're serving at the church. So you didn't have a career that you had to give up to go do this. But how did you, and if you did, correct me, but how did you feel? Like, this is what I'm really after here. How did the pastor pulling you aside and talking to you about your calling, how did that inside your heart and your mind, and like how did that make you feel, and how would you attribute your response to that conversation?
Well, let me juxtapose that with the conversations I was having with my dad. So at the time, I was going to Maricosta College, and I was with the goal of studying physical therapy.
Okay.
And because I was doing martial arts and I was training Olympic Taekwondo, and I wanted to compete in Olympic Taekwondo, and then come back and be a sports trainer. But yeah, and so while I'm going to school there, my father, who at the time is the divorce decree, had to help pay for college, didn't want me to go, and he was very conflict oriented. So I started to, it was this period of time I started to withdraw from college because his abusive behavior, my grades were starting to suffer because he was just calling and harassing me, and I was having a hard time.
With him, right?
Well, juxtapose that. I wasn't living with him, but juxtapose that.
Okay.
I wasn't. I was living with my mom, as I chose to live with my mom.
Okay, so you
by
mentioned earlier that you were forced to live with your dad. That's why I asked.
Well, I was forced to be with him for a night, and then but
Okay.
I wasn't living with my father. When the divorce happened, I chose to live with my mom because it was a safer place.
All right, I didn't know.
But to answer your question, so that the conversations I'm having with my father about my future is very conflict oriented. He doesn't want to pay for college, and then come along an adult male who's having a positive conversation with me about what do you think God wants me to do. And I have to say that, I mean, it felt good to have an adult male have a non-conflict oriented conversation with me about my future. Now, I was at a place that I had a future that I was working on, but I decided to go with the calling of God.
Yeah.
Right, based upon the conflict with my father, needing a break from everything, and then this conversation he's having with me. So yeah, it was a very human thing.
Yeah, that's why that's why I pressed that issue, is because I often wonder, and of course you and I can only speculate on this. We're not, researchers in this way where we're doing scientific, double-blind studies on this types of stuff. But I suspect that a great many people that go into full-time ministry in some of these lay capacities and some of these charismatic and evangelical environments that are less formalized in terms of their educational requirements. Like when you talk about an Assemblies of God college, it reminds me of also the Calvary Chapel. So Calvary Chapel has a college in Southern California, And so if you go to college at Calvary Chapel, they'll ordain you and give you an education, and they'll give you a nominal survey of various courses, but it's all from an evangelical apologist perspective. You're not actually getting academic learning like you get, say, at Yale or Harvard or something like that. You're getting an apologist's version of how you should understand the history of your faith, right?
And that was very annoying. That was very annoying. When when in Bible college, I was annoyed by the statement of faith, because like my New Testament survey class, they give you this book and it's the theology with a bunch of verses, and then you got to study, and it's like, what am I studying? Like I remember we did a hermeneutics class, and we're talking about, I mean, half of the courses are eisegesis, and then we have a hermeneutics class that's talking about looking at the passage within its context and its culture, and who are the who, what, where, why, and how, and all that of a passage. And I'm like, yeah, that's what we should do. And then I go over to my Galatians class, and it's like hopping through the verses, and you're like, yeah, to be honest, in this martial art we're doing bilateral coordination. When you're using your right and left hemisphere, sometimes it crashes in the middle, like you can kind of feel your neural load. I felt like I was feeling a neural overload, and I'm like, okay, I'm not even sure within the context that verse means what you're saying in your statement of faith. So a lot of my frustration with the Southwestern Assemblies of God Bible College began really like, I'm studying a statement of faith, not the Bible itself. And I started to have conflict with my professors about the text of Scripture versus forcing this theological conundrum down somebody's throat. And I remember one of my classes that it was kind of like near the end of my tenure at Southwestern, and it was the Old Testament survey class. They get into document hypothesis, and amazing thing is they're getting all textual critical on the Old Testament. This is not something they do with the New Testament, which is an amazing thing, because you're like very critical of this, but no critical at all. No, there's nothing critical of the New Testament at all, and you're just like, there's a little this is not, it's contradictory. And
I'm surprised they even the documentary hypothesis with you.
Yeah. It was part of that Old Testament survey class. Yeah. Huh?
Yeah. They probably thought they were enormously progressive for doing that.
I guess so. But yeah, it was one of the topics in there.
Yeah.
I distinctly remember it. And
that was your first exposure to that, correct?
Was that?
Was that your first exposure to the critical scholarship approach?
Yeah. But I mean, I think I had already been doing it myself, incidentally, looking at things within the text.